a pleasure to have you here. I'm Chris Jones. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and I'm very excited to have this topic featured tonight. So we're going to be dealing with a very hot topic in international relations, the Korea situation, and we're very fortunate to have what I would call resident talent. And that's the purpose of the LAS lecture series, is to highlight the amazing faculty that we have in our college, and we rotated across departments and disciplines. And tonight we have a colleague from the Institute of International Studies, Dr. Jin-Yoon Kim, who's been with us for 6 years and was recently awarded tenure and promotion to associate professor. So we're very happy to now that she's a permanent member of the franchise, we're going to work her even harder. And she was kind enough to agree to talk on her area of specialization. So she is an international relations and comparative politics specialist that focuses on East Asia. And I thought, what a wonderful time when we track what's going on in the news and in academic journals and in policy outlets, all the things going on with North and South Korea and Northeast Asia. I thought it just made a great deal of sense to ask Jin-Yoon to talk to you tonight. So I'm very excited about this topic. I'm pleased that you said yes, and I'm very happy with the wonderful turnout. She's going to talk for about 45 minutes. She'll take your questions and with some great answers, and then we'll have a little community building with some refreshments and chatting and things of that sort. So thank you all for being here, and without further ado, Dr. Jin-Yoon Kim.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming. I'm sorry about the temperature. There's nothing we can do about it, so please bear with me. But before we begin, I'd like to thank Dean Jones and LAS for giving me the opportunity to talk about the issue that's close to my heart, so to Korea. So I'd like to talk about security and stability on the Korean Peninsula, some of the latest and recent development, changes and continuities in the logic behind North Korea's nuclear strategy and South Korea's ongoing efforts to resume dialogue with the North. And also, I'd like to touch upon the limits and potential of the two Koreas when it comes to more proactively building a lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula within the context of the China-US rivalry and the power politics. So we are all familiar with the enduring tensions on the Korean Peninsula, the two Koreas still being technically at war because we've never signed a peace treaty, or the North Korean leaders' obsession with their own security and their survival in what they consider to be a hostile regional environment, and their paranoia about the U.S. policy of preemptive strike, and their paranoia about the U.S. plan to collapse the regime in Pyongyang. So against this backdrop, while North Korea has accelerated its nuclear weapons program, missile program, we are all familiar about that. So, so far, North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear tests. The first one back in 2006, the latest one in September of last year. And compared to other major powers in the international system, actually, North Korea has conducted only 6 times the number of nuclear tests. 6 times, that's a lot lower than the number of nuclear tests conducted by other major powers. But North Korea has conducted more nuclear tests than India and Pakistan, both of which are considered as a de facto nuclear weapon states by the international community. Acceleration of nuclear weapons development. Well, it's been noticeable, especially under the leadership of Kim Jong-un recently. And also, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, rattled the region in the past few years with a series of long-range missile tests, disproving skepticism that North Korea would ever be able to build an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of reaching the United States. And on top of that, we've seen and heard an escalation of war of words, right? So President Trump of the United States and Chairman Kim spent last year making belligerent statements about each other, with Trump mocking Kim as a little rocket man, pledging to totally destroy North Korea and promising to rain down fire and fury like the world has never seen before on North Korea, while Kim calling Trump the mentally deranged old man and a lunatic and threatened to attacked Guam. And in a New Year's Day speech this year, Kim said that he has a nuclear button on his desk that could reach the United States. Nuclear button, he could just use it to send the missiles and the nuclear weapons to the United States. And Trump responded with a tweet saying that I too have a nuclear the button, and mine is bigger and much more powerful, and mine actually works. So against this backdrop of the escalation of tensions, America's fear of North Korea has been rising as well. So last year, North Korea actually tops the list. Number one, it's considered as the greatest threat to the United States than any other entities in the world. The greatest evil, enemy of all. That was the status of North Korea last year. And some of you may still remember what happened earlier this year, right? So we had a false alarm of an incoming missile strike in Hawaii that sent citizens scrambling for shelter in a situation reminiscent of the duck and cover drill of the Cold War. Some of you may still remember, the duck and cover drill of the Cold War. So the situation was very similar. But speaking of the Cold War, it is not really the thing of the past for the two Koreas, right? Cold War. It's not really the thing of the past for the two Koreas. And the Korean War, as we all know, is not over. And what was supposed to be the temporary division, it has turned out to be not so temporary. And in the JSA, the Joint Security Area, we have the building where the Korean War armistice was signed, is still standing. It's considered as one of the last vestiges of the Cold War. And especially in the border area, the atmosphere here is very edgy. You don't even have to understand the Korean language that this is a warning sign. Do not come close or take pictures because this is the area protected by the military. And the DMZ, this 160 miles long, 2.5 miles wide, demilitarized zone. This is the symbol of division, symbol of confrontation on the Korean Peninsula. Constant reminder that the Cold War never really ended here. So it was against this backdrop that South Korea had to prepare for its Winter Olympics, which was scheduled to be held in Pyeongchang, only about 62 miles away from the DMZ. And as we all know, the leads up to the Olympics, it was affected by the increasing tensions between US and North Korea, causing security concerns, with several countries considering to skip the game if their safety was not ensured. But for years, South Korea tried to promote the Pyeongchang Olympics as a peace Olympics, as an opportunity to ease tension through the sporting events. And such determination was reflected in South Korean President Moon Jae-in's speech given to the UN General Assembly on September 21st, 2017, just a few weeks after North Korea's latest nuclear weapons test. So in his speech, South Korean President Moon Jae-in, he said that he tried to promote Olympics as an opportunity to build peace. Okay, it's an opportunity for us, opportunity for building peace and economic cooperation in Northeast Asia, where the remnant of the Cold War and hope for the future and confrontation and cooperation coexist. And while encouraging North Koreans to attend the Winter Olympics in South Korea, President Moon, he also stressed that his government in Seoul does not seek the collapse of North Korea, nor the unification by absorption. Okay? That's not what we are trying to do. That's his message. And he said that if North Korea makes a decision to stop its reckless choices and to abandon its hostile policies against other countries and to give up its nuclear weapons program and choose the path of dialogue, he said that South Korea would be ready to assist the North together with the international community. And as a matter of fact, under the leadership of President Moon, South Korea's approach towards the challenges posed by North Korea, it has been consistent and persistent. Which is the firm pressure against North Korea's provocation, while leaving the door open to dialogue should North Korea change course towards a peaceful resolution. And another consistent message from Moon is that there cannot be another outbreak of war. Okay? There should be no outbreak of war in the region. The consequences would be devastating not just for the Korean Peninsula, but for the entire Northeast Asian region and the world. So that was his message. And this message that he presented at the UN, it was actually closely linked with his Berlin Declaration. Berlin Declaration that he made in July of 2017, only about 2 months after his election. So Berlin Declaration, this speech basically unveiled his policy towards North Korea. So he said that our priority, okay, South Korea, our #1 priority is to establish peace and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but not through armed conflicts, but through the combination of pressure and incremental trust building. That was his message. So it basically represented his attempt to find the right balance between the soft approaches and the hardline approaches embraced by his predecessors, neither of which turned out to be not so effective, right? So he tried to make a balance between these two extremes. So for instance, in the past, from 1998 until 2008, we had liberal President Kim Dae-jung, President Roh Moo-hyun supported this policy of engagement. These two liberal presidents, they followed what's known as the Sunshine Policy. That was the name of the policy, Sunshine Policy. 햇볕 정책, embrace North Korea with our warmth, and it also focused on the inter-Korean economic interactions and cultural people-to-people exchanges as a means to induce changes in North Korea. And it was actually under the leadership of President Kim Dae-jung that we had the very first Inter-Korean Summit in 2000, and then under the leadership of President Roh Moo-hyun, that we had the second Inter-Korean Summit in 2007. So these two liberal presidents, Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, and their policy of engagement, Sunshine Policy, it was a very important turning point in the sense that people in both sides started seeing each other not as outright enemy, but someone who are similar, who share the same ethnic and cultural background with same history and same language, but people who are living, of course, under a very different political system. So this policy of engagement, it gave a very important, valuable opportunity for the people in the South, for instance, to humanize the people in the North. Okay, so North Korea, even though it is a totalitarian regime, but this is the country that contains more diversity of opinions than commonly assumed, with people who are not simply these brainwashed robots, but real people with real opinions, real feelings, and real emotions. Not, these demons with red faces and scary horns coming out of their heads. That used to be the image that South Korean had about the communists in North Korea. But we started changing our perspective about the people living on the other side of the DMZ. So in that regard, President Kim Dae-jung and President Roh Moo-hyun, these two liberal presidents, they made a significant contribution into the inter-Korean rapprochement, okay, to help people stop demonizing and start humanizing the people on the other side of the DMZ, demilitarized zone. So that's the biggest contribution made by these two liberal presidents, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, biggest contribution. But critics argue that their Sunshine Policy of engagement, it was just too soft. And South Korea has constantly provided economic assistance to North Korea without gaining a lot in return, right? So it was not really a reciprocal interaction. So that's the biggest criticism of the Sunshine Policy of engagement. And after that, we had a decade of conservative rule under the leadership of President Lee Myung-bak and President Park Geun-hye. Decade of conservative rule, ending the Sunshine Policy of engagement and increasing tension between the two Koreas. And it was under the leadership of this conservative Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye that people in South Korea and people in the region and the world had to witness the acceleration of North Korea's provocation and North Korea's weapons development. So these two conservative presidents, they supported a hardline policy towards North Korea, but But they were just too tough, being tough without achieving anything, without making anything, without improving the situation. Actually, they made the security situation worse, right? So that's the criticism of the policy supported by conservative Lee Myung-bak and conservative Park Geun-hye. So in case of current South Korean president, he tried to make a balance between these two extremes, right? So Moon Jae-in is largely considered as a liberal president who has supported this idea about engagement with North Korea even before he was elected. But nonetheless, Moon Jae-in did not shy away from condemning North Korea's nuclear and missile program and calling North Korea's intercontinental ballistic missile test launching as a provocation, reckless choice. And in addition to that, Moon Jae-in, he openly supported this famous CVID principle. We are all familiar with that, the complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. He openly supported this the principle. But what's interesting and noteworthy is that CVID, it is largely considered, it used to be considered as a principle supported by the hardliners. Principle supported by the hardliners, the principle that symbolizes a school of thoughts that views engagement and dialogue with North Korea simply as appeasement and rewarding the bad behavior. But in case of Moon Jae-in, even though it's largely considered as a liberal president who supported engagement, he also openly supported this principle of the CVID as the absolute necessary condition for peace on the Korean Peninsula. And also, he repeatedly supported sanctions. Okay? He repeatedly supported sanctions. He said that sanctions should remain as part of our efforts to change the course of the North Korea's behavior. So his support of the international sanction actually provided explicit support to Washington's approach. So that was also quite different from Moon Jae-in's liberal predecessor. So critics argue that Liberal President Kim Dae-jung, Liberal President Roh Moo-hyun, in their eagerness to support the policy of engagement, these previous two liberal presidents, they overlooked the significance of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, okay? Even ignored it, probably unintentionally, but that was the impression that these two earlier liberal presidents presented to the United States. But Moon Jae-in, he wanted to avoid that mistake. So, as a matter of fact, the current president of South Korea, he constantly emphasized the importance of South Korea's alliance with the U.S., based upon which the South can retain our overwhelming military superiority vis-a-vis North Korea, and South can more effectively pursue peace, but peace based upon strengths. So he actually took a very firm stance against North Korea's provocation. Okay, firm stance against North Korea's provocation. But at the same time, Moon Jae-in also described sanctions as something that could be reversed. These are just the diplomatic tools against North Korea, means to guide North Korea towards making the right choice, but it's not an end in itself. Okay, so that was another position he made. He tried to convey to the people in North Korea, and also Moon repeatedly expressed his willingness to accept and willingness to respect North Korea as equal. And also made himself clear that he neither wishes for the North Korea to collapse, nor that North Korea, he will work towards any kind of unification through absorption. But rather, he described unification as a long-term process. There would not be such thing as an instant unification, but rather it will be a long-term process where both sides would first learn to peacefully coexist and co-prosper. But unification, it will occur when the time is right, when the appropriate time comes. But we will not rush into achieving this goal through any artificial, hasty, forceful measure. That was another message. And on top of that, Moon also emphasized Korea's leading role, the need for Korea to be in the driver's seat when it comes to the inter-Korean relationship and also eventual unification. And also not to surrender the future of Korea to the outside forces. Okay? His emphasis about Korea taking the active role is understandable if you're familiar with the history of Korea as a minor player. The future of Korea or the fate of Korea, oftentimes it was determined by the outside forces. So Moon Jae-in, he argued that it's important for Korea to determine the future of Korea, Korea taking the driver's seat. But at the same time, he emphasized that we have to work with our neighbors, and we have to work with our partners to achieve this goal. So peace on the Korean Peninsula, it can only be achieved in collaboration with and consultation with the international community, our allies and partners alike. So Moon Jae-in, he's right to stress that the Korean unification is a Korean affair. Of course, it is a Korean affair. Korea is an independent country. But also, this guy, he is wise enough and he is pragmatic enough to duly recognize the interest of the outside forces, these bigger powers, that like it or not, they can make or break the future of Korea. So the goal of creating a peace system on the Korean Peninsula, it will remain simply as an elusive dream, unreachable dream, without the support, without the help of the international community. And that's the reason why Moon Jae-in, even while he was trying to emphasize the active role of Korea to determine the future of the country, he also acknowledged that it will be achieved in collaboration with the international community. So if you take a look at it, the points that he tried to make in his Berlin Declaration, it makes perfect sense. Okay, making the right balance between the extremes of these two policies, embrace this principle of the complete dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear weapons program, emphasis on the U.S.-South Korean alliance, and also Korea taking the leading role but achieve this goal in collaboration with the international community. All of this sounded nice. You know, what's not to like about achieving all of that? But still, an idea of reigniting the process of inner Korean rapprochement, not to mention hosting the Peace Olympic, it seemed just unrealistic. It seemed just too naive until the end of the last year. But then we had a dramatic turn of events when North Korean leader Kim Jong-un extended an offer in his New Year's address to reduce tensions with South Korea, suggesting that he was interested in dialogue with the South, and Moon Jae-in, of course, eagerly accepted Kim Jong-un's offer, which eventually led to the North and South Korean athletes entering the Olympics opening game together under the unified flag. But as a matter of fact, North and South Korean athletes, they marched together several times prior to this. Okay, so it's nothing new, but this year, not a lot of people expected this joint entrance because of the tensions that we experienced, right? Not a lot of people expected this drama in Pyeongchang because of the heightened tensions, because of the absence of dialogue and interactions between the two Koreas in the past few years. But everything happened so rapidly. So athletes from North and South Korea, they entered the stadium together wearing the white jacket with Korea on their back, each holding the Korea unification flag. So it was a very powerful, symbolic, even an emotional image to a lot of people in the country. And not only that, Kim Jong-un, North Korean leader, decided to send his younger sister, Kim Yo-jong, to attend the game along with Kim Yong-nam, who is actually the North Korea's nominal head of state. But all the attention, of course, was given to Kim Yo-jong because she was the one considered to have one of the most influential, the power, the role in North Korea. So it was a historic visit in the sense that she became the very first ever member. Okay, she became the very first member of the ruling Kim family to visit South Korea. And like I said, one of the most influential, powerful people in North Korea. So North Korean delegation to South Korea during their 3-day visit to South Korea, they had a series of meetings with high-level South Korean officials. And Moon Jae-in, of course, invited North Korean delegation to the presidential Blue House. And Kim Yo-jong, before she left, she delivered a message from her brother to Moon Jae-in, inviting Moon Jae-in for a meeting with the chairman Kim, the invitation that Moon Jae-in treated positively. But Moon also said that we would have to work together to create an environment under which this meeting would become appropriate. But even until then, there were a lot of skepticism. Understandably, there were a lot of skepticisms, a lot of questions about whether the progress made during the Olympics, the so-called winter-fall, would last. Okay, so a lot of reasonable criticisms and questions existed. And then with the Olympics over, Moon Jae-in, in order to keep the ball rolling, he decided to dispatch his envoys, this time to Pyongyang. Okay, so among the envoys, we had Seo-hun, the director of South Korea's National Intelligence Service, and Chung Eui-yong, the National Security Advisor to Moon Jae-in. So they were among the first South Koreans sent to the North Korea in 11 years. And Chairman Kim, he invited South Korean envoys to the ruling Workers' Party headquarters. Workers' Party is the North Korean version of the Communist Party. So Kim Jong-un invited these South Korean envoys to his workplace and the Workers' Party headquarters. So these South Koreans, actually, they became the very first South Korean ever to set foot inside the party headquarters since the Korean War. And Kim Jong-un also, he made a lot of efforts. He attempted to enhance North Korea's image as a normal country, hosting this 4-hour banquet with his wife, Lee Seol-ju, who was introduced as the first lady, not comrade, for the first time in their history. And Kim Jong-un, this young man, he went out of his way to present a different side of him, not as a ruthless dictator, but as a civilized and humorous and young and vibrant leader of a country. And Kim Jong-un, actually, he surprised the South Korean diplomats by expressing his willingness to end the country's isolation and provocation. And in particular, Kim Jong-un laid out his proposal, which includes his willingness to talk with the United States on denuclearization and suspension of nuclear and missile tests during these talks. And also, Kim Jong-un said that he understood that the U.S. and South Korea, U.S. and South Korea must proceed with the annual joint military exercises. And that statement actually shocked the South Korean envoys. Kim Jong-un accepting the joint U.S.-South Korean military drill as a reality. It shocked the South Korean envoys. Why was that? Because previously, North Korean leaders, they considered this U.S.-South Korean joint military exercise simply as a war rehearsal, the plan to change the regime in Pyongyang. But this time, Kim Jong-un, he said that, I understood that as a reality, and I'm not going to overreact to this. I'm not going to make my own provocation during the time of this annual U.S.-South Korean joint military exercises. That was another huge statement. And he also added that he was eager to hold a summit meeting with his South Korean counterparts, Moon Jae-in. And actually, we had a date set for this Inner-Korean summit on April 27th, in about 2 weeks. And for this meeting, Kim Jong-un would come to here, the Pyonghwae Jeep. This is the Peace House located in the south side of the military demarcation line. So this yellow line is the military demarcation line. This is the north side, and this is the south side. And for this Inner-Korean summit on April 27, Kim Jong-un would come to this house. Okay, so this will be the very first time, actually. This will be the very first time that a North Korean leader ever come to visit the South since the end of the Korean War. So it would carry an enormous significance. Okay? So these were the agreements that Kim Jong-un and South Korean envoys made about a month ago, right? It's about a month ago. And that was not the end of the story. So the pace of rapprochement further accelerated when Moon Jae-in immediately sent his envoys to, this time, of course, we have to visit the United States, right? So South Korean envoys visited Washington, had a meeting with senior White House officials and President Trump, and conveyed Kim Jong-un's message, including Kim's invitation to President Trump. And Trump agreed on the spot to meet with Kim for talks, which was a remarkable breakthrough, right? Remarkable breakthrough after months of insult and months of military threats and mutual hostility and exchanges between these two leaders. But now they're talking about dialogue, getting together to resolve this matter. But what's interesting was that it was the South Korean National Security Advisor, Chung Eui-yong, who announced that Trump accepted Kim Jong-un's invitation to meet to talk about this permanent denuclearization. It was an extraordinary scene, highly unusual for a foreign official and accompanied by the U.S. officials to announce the American president's decision in a major international situation. Very unusual scene, but of course nothing is usual, nothing is conventional at Trump White House these days. So in that regard, it can be considered as a normal picture. But anyhow, so the talks, if it actually happens, it would be the first ever face-to-face meeting between the sitting U.S. president and the North Korean leader. So the significance of this, it could almost be compared to the President Nixon's visit to China and his meeting with Chairman Mao that happened in the early 1970s. So of course, the gravity of this announcement, it grabbed the global attention, made the headlines all over the world just immediately. But what's less known and less publicized is the continuation and intensification of both official preparatory meetings and also unofficial backtrack diplomacy happening in some other parts of the world. So for instance, North Koreans have participated in the Track 2 diplomacy. That's the unofficial back-channel diplomacy with American and South Korean counterparts in a country like Finland to discuss the U.S.-North Korean summit and the Inter-Korean Summit. So this guy in the picture, Choi Kang-il, one of the high-level officials, the senior North Korean diplomats handling North American affairs, he went to Finland last month for the unofficial back-channel diplomacy and a series of diplomatic encounters to talk about the U.S.-North Korea Summit and the Inter-Korean Summit. And also, Lee Young-ho, another influential figure, the North Korean foreign minister, he's been very busy recently as well. So he visited Sweden last month, which prompted speculation that his trip could also lay the groundwork for the possible meeting between Trump and Kim. And more recently, Lee went to Beijing and had a talk with his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi. And right after that meeting, he went to Azerbaijan to attend the ministerial meeting of non-aligned movement, and he called for the non-aligned countries to support the process of rapprochement and trust building on the Korean peninsula. And he was, just 2 days ago, he was in Russia. He was in Moscow, had a meeting with his Russian counterparts, the Sergei Lavrov, the Russian, the foreign minister. So he's been very visible, very busy in the past few months and weeks. So it implies that North Korea is really serious about diplomacy this time. And meanwhile, well, maybe the picture's not that clear, but anyone recognize the guy in the middle? We have the president of Bulgaria, Rumen Radev, and South Korean ambassador to Bulgaria and North Korean ambassador to Bulgaria took that picture last month. So what happened was that North Korean diplomats in Bulgaria attended a luncheon organized by the Bulgarian president for the Asian diplomats in his country, but the venue was at the South Korean embassy. The venue was at the South Korean embassy, but it was very unusual for North Korean diplomats actually attending a meeting at the South Korean embassy. So that picture can also be understood as part of this new wave of rapprochement between the two Koreas. And then the latest in a flurry of diplomatic activity in recent weeks, and more widely known events, of course, is the Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un meeting. Okay, so prior to Kim's meeting with Trump and Kim's meeting with Moon Jae-in, Kim Jong-un realized that it's better for him to have a meeting with his ally, Xi Jinping. So it was a very smart decision, smart move, of course, right? So Kim Jong-un made a surprise trip to meet with the president of China, Xi Jinping, and that was Kim Jong-un's first trip ever to another country since he took power back in 2011. And China labeled Kim Jong-un's first visit unofficial, okay? China said that it was unofficial, but there was nothing unofficial about this meeting with this red carpets and the banquets and, you know, the ceremonies and securities involved in this process. And Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, they talked about their traditional friendship and the socialist solidarity and the enduring bonds between these two countries. So, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un meeting, it definitely added another layer of complexity to the rush of the global diplomacy around North Korea's nuclear weapons program. And this meeting also signaled a potentially warming relationship, potential for in 7 years of tension between these longtime allies. But their relationship in the past few years has been very chilly because of the North Korea's nuclear test and provocation and China's decision to support the UN-led sanctions against North Korea. So the relationship between China, North Korea in the previous few years, it has been awkward or uncomfortable to say the least. But this meeting, the Beijing meeting, it was staged to show that China-U.S. ties are now back on track, okay? These ties now back on track. So Chinese President Xi Jinping, by being proactive and getting involved in the changes on the Korean Peninsula, he tried to make sure that China's national interests are respected. It was necessary, China's national interest being respected. And for Beijing, the Kim Jong-un's meeting, it was a great opportunity to reassert itself as a major player, as a core player in any deliberations involving North Korea, which China traditionally considered as its own sphere of influence. So, despite years of chilly, unfriendly relationship, Kim Jong-un Xi Jinping meeting was possible because of the convergence of interest between these two leaders. Their interests overlap. So China wants to prevent the United States, okay? As a rising power in the region, China wants to prevent the United States from gaining too much influence over the Korean affairs. And also, China would like to maintain the regional balance of power. Regional balance of power, if it's not completely in favor of China, it should at least not be in favor of the United States and its allies. So China had to step in, and China had to let their presence known before it was too late. What about Kim Jong-un? Well, Kim Jong-un could enhance his legitimacy. With this meeting, as a leader who can recognize by a leader of another country, not just any other country, but this rising power like China. So enhancement of Kim Jong-un's legitimacy, and also Kim Jong-un could enhance his bargaining leverage. Enhance his bargaining leverage using the U.S.-China friction over trade issues and the South China Sea and the Taiwan and Tibet questions, et cetera, et cetera. So the U.S.-China rivalry for supremacy and conflict between these two great powers, it provided great opportunity for Kim Jong-un to obtain benefits from both sides. Okay, so even though he's very young, 34 years old, but he's pretty smart, right? So we are seeing a carefully calculated and carefully crafted North Korean strategy on diplomacy unfolding on a regional and global stage. So Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, they argue that, they agree that, well, if South Korea and U.S. respond with goodwills to our efforts and create an atmosphere of peace and stability and take phased and synchronized measures to achieve peace, the issue of the denuclearization of the peninsula, it can reach the resolution. So Kim Jong-un, well, finally, he's openly talking about peace, he's openly talking about denuclearization. Well, that's something positive. That's something new, right? So it's a huge difference, at least in terms of his rhetoric, okay? At least in terms of his rhetoric. So this picture and this meeting perhaps is one of the most widely known recent development in the past few weeks, right? It happened, 2 weeks ago? 2 weeks ago, everything is happening so fast, rapidly, right? But in addition to this, another very important event, but less publicized event, was the K-pop concert that happened in South Korea. So amid improving relationship between the two Koreas, we actually had a K-pop concert in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. So the performance by South Korean musicians in the capital of North Korea, and the title of that concert was Spring is Coming. Okay, that was the title, very appropriate title, wishful title even, right? And this meeting, it was attended by Chairman Kim. And right next to Kim, we have the culture minister of South Korea, Do Jong-wan, okay, who led the South Korean singers to the North Korean concert. And this is the picture of Kim Jong-un in the middle, surrounded by the South Korean rock band and the girl groups, and a relatively older, the singers who are more widely known among people in North Korea. Ironically, this picture was released on April 1st, April Fool's Day. So South Koreans jokingly said that it could not be real, right? It's just so unexpected, right? But that's a real picture, okay? But nobody, not a lot of people actually expected to see this picture even a few weeks ago. So that's another positive development. In addition to that, just one more image that I'd like to show you before I get into the actual analysis is the picture of Kim Jong-un. And anyone recognize the guy next to Kim Jong-un? He was all over the news 2 months ago. He's the president of the International Olympic Committee, IOC president. He also visited Pyongyang last month, had a meeting with Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un expressed his appreciation for IOC's support and for cooperation with North Korea during the time of Olympics. And they watched the soccer game together, and Kim Jong-un also promised to attend the Summer Olympics in Japan in 2 years and Winter Olympics in China in 4 years. And the picture taken 2 months ago in Pyeongchang during the Olympics, we have the IOC president in the middle, South Korean President Moon Jae-in and his wife, North Korean delegation, high-level South Korean officials, and North Korean cheerleaders all in the same picture. It's just, yeah, nobody expected to see this until a few months ago, right? So it's a very iconic picture. And IOC President Thomas Bach, he is a German native. He's a German native, and he himself was an Olympian back in the 70s. Olympian back in the 70s when we had 2 Germanys, right? So probably because of his position as a president of IOC, but also maybe because of his personal background as someone who also experienced this division of the nation, he was very supportive, openly supportive of this idea about North Korea participating in this Pyeongchang Olympics in South Korea, and also has been very supportive of this idea presented by President Moon Jae-in to use Olympics as a catalyst to reignite this dialogue and the relationship between the 2 Koreas. So again, everything has been happening so fast, so rapidly. So the big question is, what exactly is going on? What exactly is going on? Can we really expect to see this Korea Spring? And what is at stake? What is at stake? So we are going to have the Inter-Korean Summit in 2 weeks. And if everything goes well, maybe the meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un, I think it's likely to happen in May or in June. And Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un meeting, already we had that meeting, and others are talking about this trilateral meeting. It could be expanded into the 6-party talks eventually. So what is going on? So all of this development, President Moon of South Korea described almost miraculous. And North Korea's willingness to bargain with the Trump administration over scraping its atomic arsenal, it surprised the world and raised hope that one of the most dangerous and most difficult confrontations of the nuclear age, well, it could be diffused, it could be resolved. So that's something positive, that's something hopeful. But Kim Jong-un's agreement to denuclearization talk is no guarantee, right? It's no guarantee that North Korea will start dismantling its arsenal immediately without any condition. And Kim Jong-un said that he would give up his nuclear weapons only when he felt no more military threats. And as some of you may be familiar with, previous efforts all collapsed over the same challenges, same hurdle. So what's new this time? Okay? What's new this time? What changed North Korea, at least in terms of their rhetoric and behavior, if not their overall strategy? Fear or confidence? Well, one interpretation is that, well, Kim Jong-un is now under growing pressure. This is the man desperately seeking his way out of sanctions that started to threaten the stability of the regime. You know, after years of economic isolation and sanctions, he is now feeling increasing pressure. And also, Kim Jong-un is alarmed by the unpredictability of President Trump. President Trump, who might be really serious about the military strike. In other words, this young man, he is scared, partly because of the intensification of economic hardship, and also because he doesn't know what to expect from Trump and Trump's maximum pressure. So that's one interpretation. But another interpretation is that, well, Kim Jong-un is now negotiating with confidence. He is negotiating with confidence. He is in a position of strength. So in November of last year, the North Korean regime declared that it has completed its missile program and nuclear program and is now ready to deal with the United States, with this superpower on an equal footing as nuclear states to nuclear states. And Kim Jong-un's credible nuclear deterrence perhaps has given him far more leverage with Washington and Seoul than his father and grandfather ever possessed. And it seems that Kim Jong-un is now increasingly becoming self-confident about what he is doing, and his openness to talk, his receptiveness to talk, it is a reflection that he is feeling increasingly strong in his position. That's another interpretation of this, the new development. The more reasonable interpretation is that maybe it's a little bit of both, right? So Kim Jong-un, of course, and the North Korean regime is feeling the pressure after years of sanctioned economic hardship, but also this young man, he now thinks that he can manage the pressure because he is in a stronger position than ever before in North Korea's modern history. Okay? And also, if you understand the North Korea's Byungjin policy, okay? Byungjin policy, it's about time for them to change their course. Okay? So this Byungjin policy, adopted in March of 2013, this is a policy of economic and national defense capability. It refers to the parallel pursuit or parallel progress. So it has two major priorities. So one priority is for North Korea to have the military strengths, including the nuclear weapons capability. And another priority is for North Korea to have the economic strengths. Given that, they consider that they've mastered the weapons technology, the nuclear technology, or almost mastered the technology. It's time for them to focus on the economic development. So if you understand the Byungjin line, it's about time for them to change their course right after ending this international isolation. Okay, so that's another interpretation. Okay then, what about us? What's at stake for the rest of us? Reigniting dialogue. What are some of the expected costs and benefits? You know, all of this recent development, okay, in a Korean summit and perhaps the future Trump and Kim Jong-un meeting, all of these are just the beginning. These are not the solution. So North Korean side clearly stated its willingness to denuclearize, and it made itself clear that it would have no reason to keep the nuclear weapons if the military threat to North Korea was eliminated, and if its security is guaranteed. And that assessment, it signaled the very first time that Kim Jong-un has openly indicated his willingness to discuss abandoning nuclear arms in return for the security guarantee from the United States. So in that regard, it's something positive. But of course, devil is in the details, right? Devil is in the details. So Kim Jong-un said that he is committed to denuclearization. But what exactly that means? He is committed to denuclearization, but what exactly that means? So there are a lot of ambiguities, and it raised more questions than presenting any clear answer with regards to his intention. But still, in order for us to figure out his intention, these talks and these meetings are necessary whether we like it or not. So yes, I'm for this talk, I'm for this dialogue. But then what will be discussed exactly? Well, each meeting will have different agenda. But denuclearization, of course, it will undoubtedly be the biggest issue that these meetings will hope to address. But while Kim Jong-un, he says that he is committed to denuclearization, we have to have a clear-eyed approach, realistic expectations of what can be actually achieved. What can be achieved and how long this whole process will take and how to verify that North Korea is actually disarming. So we are all familiar with this CVID, okay, complete verifiable irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear weapons, supported by South Korea, US, international community that all embrace the UN sanctions against North Korea. But what North Korea wants is CVIG, okay, it's short for what? Complete, verifiable, irreversible, guarantee of its security, right? Guarantee of its security. That's what North Korea wants. But achieving these two ultimate goals and exchanging these two, it would have to embark the difficult task of addressing more than 70 years of distrust and security dilemma on all sides. But unfortunately, under the current situation, expecting the immediate denuclearization of North Korea is not quite realistic, but rather it would require the long-term vision, the long-term plan, starting with the nuclear freeze, but based upon trust And based upon improved ties through this process of negotiation, we can ultimately reach this end goal of denuclearization. So CVIG and CVID, achieving this ultimate goal, it will definitely not come instantly, but over a long period of time with many milestones along the way. But if you think about it, United States and North Korea, these two end goals, CVID and CVIG, are these two incompatible? Well, probably so. If the United States seek to achieve, if the North Korea, for instance, if the North Korea seek to achieve its regime guarantee only through nuclearization, only through provocation, only through the violation of its prior commitments, then this goal is not achievable. Or if the United States wants to achieve denuclearization of North Korea only through the pressure, only through the military strike, which can intensify the North Koreans' conviction that U.S. simply emphasized denuclearization as a precursor to collapse the regime of Pyongyang. Okay, so that has been the pattern in the previous years, but it doesn't have to be that way. So we need to change our perspective about how to get there, right? So moving towards a positive peace, it would be possible only when we work towards creating an environment where all sides could be relatively assured and all sides could be relatively satisfied with the process, but also the end goal of the negotiation. So it is in the spirit that President Moon Jae-in of South Korea talked about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula that guarantees the security of the North Korean regime. So respecting and accommodating North Korean demands for the CVIG while seeking our goal of CVID and ultimately working towards establishing the permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. But that, of course, is the ultimate goal, right? It will not happen just overnight. But what's interesting is that even President Trump and other U.S. leaders, Jim Mattis and the Pompeo recently, they are talking about this idea about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula that also guarantees the security of North Korea. So we are talking about this. But how can we get there? Of course, that will be the ultimate challenge. Okay, ultimate challenge that the U.S. and South Korea and the international community have to deal with in the coming months and years, right? So I was going to talk a little bit about my own perspective about this issue, but given that we are running out of time, so I'll just stop here and I'll open the floor for the questions if you have any. Okay. Any questions?
Well, I have a question
Sure.
on human rights.
Uh-huh.
You talked about this humanization that Moon talked about, that you want to humanize North Korean people. Isn't North Korea still very much a closed society?
It's still very much a closed society, but also we've been witnessing some major changes inside North Korea, not just changes up in the leadership level, but they have now thousands of what's called Changmadang. It's a black market. It's the the farmers market is actually happening, and the government, of course, is looking the other way because the government leaders themselves, they recognize that, well, we cannot provide the necessities for the people, so let people define their own way of living, right? So in this black market, North Korean, just ordinary people, they can have access to the outside information, this DVDs, the USB with the movies inside from South Korea or the China smuggled into North Korea. So they have access to this outside information that's gradually changing the North Koreans' perceptions about their own system. So many analysts, optimists, they are now saying that even though we haven't seen any big changes, people directly challenging the leadership, if this pattern continues, maybe this grassroots level changes can eventually also bring about the bigger changes, the political, systemic changes in the long run. But that's, of course, a hopeful prediction. But in order for them to reach that level, it will take some time, right? Okay?
You mentioned recently, or back in the presentation, about how Kim Jong-un promised to also go to the Summer Olympics in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious on Japan's kind of outlook and take on all the diplomacy that's happened, because they kind of been on like the forefront of the missile tests that were happening last year.
Good.
And I know that there was kind of not hostility, but a lot of fear on the Japan island.
Very good. Japan actually, up until recently, felt left out, okay, because this inner Korean rapprochement, it happened so rapidly, and Kim Jong-un also had a meeting with Xi Jinping and also reached out to Trump to have this the summit. But Japan, well, it was just isolated. So recently, Japanese Prime Minister visited South Korea in order to consolidate the democratic, the friendship between the Japan and South Korea, and of course the United States, because Japan also have a lot in the stake. So like I said, all of these meetings will have different agendas, but in case of Japan, the number one goal that the Japanese public would like to address is the abduction issue, right? I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that, but North Korea, back in the 70s and 80s, abducted the Japanese citizens in order to use them as a language trainer, right? So it caused the revelation of this, the happening more recently. It caused a lot of the criticism against the Japanese leaders not doing enough to address this matter, right? So Japan and Japanese leaders would like to address that issue, and also if everything goes well, and if this negotiation would eventually involve this process about the international community providing the economic support, Japan also has a lot to offer, right? So Japan, of course, it should take part in this whole process. Previously, Japan was one of the members of the six-party talks, and Japan also wants to, return back to that previous position. So definitely, we should engage Japan. It's one of the closest allies of the United States, and as a democratic country, United States and South Korea and Japan have to consolidate our, relationship when dealing with this North Korea's nuclear threat. So, Danny, you made a very good point. Yes.
So I am interested in sort of your analysis.
Uh-huh.
So as an international relations scholar, if I said we really want to try to construct a parsimonious explanation of North Korea's behavior, what leading theory of international relations would you say had the most explanatory power? Would it be realism? Would it be liberalism? Would it be constructivism? I'm sure there's a lot of students in your class here who know those theories. Which theory do you think offers the most insight into North Korean behavior at this juncture?
I would like to say pragmatic realism. Power, of course, is a very important factor. North Korea's sense of insecurity and what they consider to be a hostile environment, that's one of the elements, the reason why North Korea feels so obsessed with its weapons capability, right? But in this process of negotiation, maybe the liberal perspective, the impact of the economy, the pacifying effect of the economic interaction, perhaps that will be the elements that can bring about the change in North Korea, the real change in North Korea. Like I say, they now have this thousands and thousands of the black markets, okay, that change the people's mindset about the system. The system is not really providing the necessity for the people. And the people are learning the basic, the logics of the supply and demands, the beauty of capitalism, right? So we, of course, cannot expect to see any fully functioning capitalism that we can find here in the Western world. We're not going to see any liberal democracy in North Korea in a few years or so, but this gradual change in North Korea, if it continues to happen, maybe the changing mentality of the people, it can also bring about the greater social changes in the long run, right? So they now want economic necessity. They now want to satisfy their economic needs, but this accumulation of wealth eventually can bring about people's greater demands for other needs, right? Political rights and the political freedom. So in the IR, we have this famous the theory that talks about the connection between the economic development and eventual political liberalization, democratization. Like I said, it's not going to happen just overnight, but if this pattern continues, who knows, maybe 20, 30 years, maybe until later, we can see that changes. If you think about the situation in South Korea, for instance, yes, we started out as a democratic country officially, but it was not really a democratic country until later. But with the development of the economy, with the support of our allies like the United States, and the changing mindset of the middle-class citizens that demanded not just their safety, not just their economic rights, but also their political rights. So these changes eventually brought about the political systemic change in South Korea. So who knows? Maybe we can see something similar, but we'll see. We'll see. Okay. But I want to be hopeful. Yes.
Kim Jong-un stated that he was willing to give up his nuclear arsenal if the threat to North Korea was eliminated. But from the news that at least I've gotten, nobody seems to be making threats to North Korea. More of counter threats from North Korea themselves make threats. So is this a valid concern, or is this some of the paranoia you were talking about earlier? And if it's the paranoia, in this case of reunifying the Koreas, more a case of convincing a paranoid person to not be paranoid, rather than implementing the actual policies needed to demilitarize the two Koreas?
Well, their sense of insecurity has been intensified during the course of their history. Well, Korean War, they initiated the Korean War, but during the time of the war, North Korean leaders had to experience this overwhelming power of the United States and the allies. And also North Korean the leaders had to deal with this not so trustworthy allies, the communist allies like China, the Soviet Union. So that intensified the North Korea threat perception. And then during the Cold War, North Korea initially was considered as a bigger military power, bigger economic power, but that changed, right, by the 70s and 80s with South Korea's economic development and further democratization, and while North Korea remained as a relatively poor country. We talked about this, the difference between North and South Korea, for instance, in terms of the economic status. We have, more than 23 times a difference in terms of the per capita income, right? So that is another, the factor that intensified North Korea's insecurity. And also, by the end of the Cold War, the international community, United States and other big powers started talking about the collapse of North Korean regime. The Soviet Union was collapsed and other Western communist powers, they've embraced democracy. Maybe North Korea will have the same path, right? So we talked about the collapse scenario of North Korea, but it's still there, right? It is still there. And the reason that they embrace this military-first strategy and the nuclear weapons, the first strategy, is because they consider that that's the only way for them to maintain their sovereignty, maintain their independence, right? So yes, from outsiders' perspective, it seems paranoia seems not so reasonable, but they have their own internal logics. And if you understand what they've been through, their own history, maybe their paranoia is not that unreasonable. Okay? Yes.
I was wondering if it's possible that Kim Jong-un is doing all these diplomatic talks in order to bring about a sort of thought from the people in the region that the U.S. military and the U.S. influence is not needed anymore, because as North Korea is becoming more peaceful, is the U.S. Needed?
That's a good question, good interpretation, and widely discussed concern actually among the policymakers here in Washington, United States. North Korea maybe want elimination of the U.S. troops there, and that will be the beginning of the U.S. Weakening influence in that critically important part of the world. But what's interesting was that Kim Jong-il, the father of the current leader, actually revealed his own intention. He said that if North Korea's security is guaranteed, we are okay with the U.S. military troop station in South Korea, okay? Maybe as a peacekeeping forces. We're not against that, partly because North Korea maybe wants to make a balance between the growing China and the United States and reap the benefits by driving the wedge between these two. So yes, the widely general assumption is that North Korea wants the elimination of the U.S. forces from South Korea. But if you have a chance to hear the comments made by the South Korean officials who actually had a chance to discuss this matter with the North Korean leaders, it's not really the case. They think that it's okay for U.S. to station in South Korea as a balancer in this region. Otherwise, China will become too powerful, and maybe China can, undermine the North Korea's own national interest, right? So, unlike our widely, embraced understanding, the North Korea's own intention is quite different, actually. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. How do you think a situation would play out where two Koreas united? Would it be more like the Berlin Wall coming down, or would it be a gradual warming of relations?
What do you mean, the North and South Korea and the United States?
Well, say like North and South Korea were to, unite. Do you think it would happen as in like a it would happen overnight, or it would take a long time?
Well, it's a good question. Previously, South Korea, this liberal president who supported the engagement policy, like I said, in their eagerness to support this policy of rapprochement, they disregarded the U.S.-South Korea relationship. Okay, turned out to be not quite effective to actually handle the North Korean matter. What's going on today under Moon administration is that Moon Jae-in, while emphasizing the need for North Korea to denuclearize, he also emphasized the U.S.-ROK relationship. Based upon the strong alliance relationship, South Korea can handle the North Korean situation, okay? Pursue the peace based upon strengths, right? So you are concerned about the North Korea maybe driving a wedge between these two close allies, the U.S., South Korea. I don't see this happening this time, but previously, actually that happened, and that was one of the major reasons why this South Korean efforts to handle the North Korea's nuclear program, it was not quite successful. But I don't think it's happening under current Moon administration.
I think we're going to cut it off here. It's quite warm in the room, so I want to thank you all for being really good sports about the heat in the room. So thank you all again for being here. Secondly, I want to thank Jill McKay and Pat Campbell for organizing the lecture. Thank you both very much. They both work in the Dean's office. Most importantly, I want to thank Dr. Kim for her great lecture and present her with a token of appreciation. So on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of the College of Arts and Sciences, we want to thank you for your great lecture.